Hello and welcome to our national learning community. Today we'll be discussing postvention and what that might look like in your community. My name is BC Echohawk and I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. On behalf of the Native Connections team and contracting officer representatives Maureen Madison and Jan Dunbar Cooper, thank you for joining us. Grantee Technical Assistant Valerie Pingayak will be facilitating our presentation with representatives from Alaska and Minnesota as they discuss how postvention strategies become prevention efforts. Please feel free to share your thoughts and comments.
And welcome everyone to today's National Learning Community on postvention efforts on a community level. My name is Valerie Kasuk Pingayak, Chipik of the Kashunamet tribe from Chivak, Alaska, and I live in Fairbanks. I'm a grantee technical assistant and support grantees throughout Alaska and one in Florida. This month, we have a lot of great information on postvention on the Native Connections podcast accessible through the weekly digest. Join former director of the White Earth Nation's Native Connections program, Verna Mickelson, in the unscripted podcast and Native Connections conversation on postvention. And don't forget to register for next week's webinar with Behavioral Health Director, Psychotherapist for Tule River Reservation, Isabel Fazon Galindo. Some of her talking points include taking the right action after a suicide can prevent future suicides. Postvention training provides an opportunity for individuals, communities, and schools and organizations to take a look into their responses after a suicide death. How postvention helps create awareness and communication between individuals and systems, and how by doing that, it helps reduce the risk of suicide and also promote healing. And through that session, you'll be able to experience firsthand what a postvention plan might look like and how one can be put together in place in your organization. Again, that's next Tuesday, February 25th. As for today's National Learning Community, it is my pleasure to welcome Matthew Kozak. He's the Wellness Director for the Kodiak Area Native Association, or CANA for short, and they're a Cohort 6 grantee. Matthew was born and raised on Kodiak Island, Alaska, as a third-generation Alaskan. Matthew holds master's degrees in industrial organizational psychology, business administration, and organizational leadership, and has spent nearly 15 years as a commercial salmon fisherman in Bristol Bay, Alaska. Matthew joined CANA, a tribal health organization serving the Kodiak region, in December of 2015 as a prevention specialist, working with the Indian Health Service Domestic Violence and Meth Suicide Prevention Initiative programs. And in June 2016, Matthew took over management of the CANA Prevention Department. Since then, Matthew has held several roles within CANA, all of which have involved prevention, community outreach, education, and behavioral health services with focus of enhancing and expanding services for Alaska Native beneficiaries and the communities within the Kodiak region. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. First off, I want to apologize. I'm just getting over a pretty nasty head cold, so if my voice sounds off or if I go on mute to cough briefly, I hope you'll give me a little bit of patience and grace. I will go ahead, I will share my screen here. So today I'm going to be speaking about a team approach to crisis response and postvention. And so really talking about what we're doing within the Kodiak Area Native Association, CANA, within the Kodiak region, and kind of the direction that we are hoping to move our behavioral health department in as it regards crisis response and postvention. To give a little bit of context for those who might not be familiar, Alaska, obviously a pretty large state. Kodiak Island is located down in the southern part of the state in the Gulf of Alaska. We are sometimes referred to as the northernmost Hawaiian island. A great example of that is while other parts of the state might be buried under snow and ice and experiencing extreme cold temperatures, Kodiak can pretty much be relied on to be rainy and in the 40s or 50s almost year round. It's a fact of life that we deal with. I think we have over 300 days of precipitation a year, which actually kind of plays into our crisis and postvention response in a big way that I'll talk about a little bit later. So looking at Kodiak Island specifically, we have roughly 3,000 Alaska Native beneficiaries across the region with 10 federally recognized tribes. And we are also home to the largest Coast Guard base in the Pacific with somewhere between 13 and 15,000 permanent residents, although that can drastically increase in the summer as a result of tourism and because of the commercial fishing industry. And then as kind of a fun fact, we're known for the Kodiak brown bear, which is the largest species of brown bear in the world. And we have approximately 3,500 bears, which is about one for every square mile. So bears are a ever-present fact of life that we get to deal with and we get to interact with. And it certainly makes life interesting in some respects. So for today's presentation, to give just kind of a brief outline, so I want to build a little bit of context about the organization that I work with, the communities that we work with, talk about some of the available resources that those communities can draw on when dealing with crisis response and postvention, talk about CANA's current approach to dealing with tragedies that occur in a village, whether it's an unexpected passing, for whatever reason, whether it's overdose, suicide, or some other reason. Talk about the desired approach, the direction that we're trying to move in, looking at some of the barriers to implementation, and then the solutions that we've come up for those. I know that from my perspective as a grantee, it's always really great to hear about what other programs are doing, but the pieces that I'm always most interested in are what are the barriers that you ran into, and then how are you working to overcome those barriers? So to start off, let's build some context. So CANA is a tribal health organization serving the Kodiak region. We provide a massive array of different services, including medical, dental, behavioral health, physical therapy, workforce development, child and family services, a huge array of other social services that are really designed to touch people at every point of their life with the goal of improving the quality of life of the people that we serve. CANA has approximately 300 full-time staff. We provide services across the entire Kodiak region. Our behavioral health department, more specifically, when we're fully staffed, which is always a challenge, as I'm sure people who work in the behavioral health field or in rural communities are fully aware of, can be challenging. But when fully staffed, we're around 40 people between our leadership, admin, mental health, substance use treatment, peer support, and most recently, our prevention team was rolled back into our behavioral health department to provide a really solid continuum of care that ranges from that early intervention and prevention piece all the way up through treatment, postvention, recovery, the whole spectrum. Kodiak Island itself is, depending on how you define it, anywhere from 7 to kind of 9 or 10 communities. And it really consists of kind of 2 breakdowns. So the first is what's referred to as the road system, and that is, as the name might imply, places that you can reach to on the road. And that includes the hub city of Kodiak, otherwise referred to as town or Kodiak for short, as well as communities in Women's Bay, Chiniak, and then a little bit to the north of Kodiak, there are some other kind of outlying communities that aren't truly defined as communities, but they're more like groupings and clusterings of small outlying areas. Then we also have what's known as the rural villages. So Uzinki, Port Lions, Larson Bay, Carlick, Akiak, and Old Harbor. And those villages range in size from 35 to 250 permanent residents. Most of them currently have schools that have anywhere from 12 to 35 or 40 students. And because of how tight-knit these communities are, many community members end up being related to each other. And so one of the sayings that we have here is, if you're not related to one half of the village, you're related to the other half. And so these are really tight-knit communities. And as a result of that, the impact of negative events can really be magnified. So when there's a loss in a community, regardless of the reason, it can really impact a huge portion of that community. And that effect can really lead to some negative outcomes. One of the other things that our rural villages really deal with is geographic isolation. As I mentioned, they're not on the road system. So the only way to access these communities is by small plane or by boat. And that can be pretty prohibitive. It takes a better part of a full day to get down to the south end of the island on a decent sized boat. It can take an hour to 2 hours by plane, but then you're looking at being cost prohibitive. So, for example, a round trip ticket from Kodiak up to Anchorage on mainland Alaska is $300 to $400, and there's 2 or 3 flights a day. Whereas if you're trying to go to Akiak or Karluk down on the south end, you're looking at $440 plus any freight charges. Anything above 50 pounds in freight is an additional charge. And they only fly out one day, once 3 days a week. So Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So if you're not on those schedules, you're having to do a charter flight, and that's multiplying your cost 3 to 4 times. Some of the villages closer to town are a little bit cheaper, but it can still get very cost prohibitive. And so as a result, there's really a limited ability to quickly get resources out to a community when something happens. So oftentimes we're faced with the question, okay, what resources do these communities have available to them that they can respond to a crisis or that they can deal with a situation where postvention is required? Unfortunately, when everything goes well, our villages can have a really robust response mechanism. And some of the main components of that include our behavioral health aides and practitioners, who are essentially a one-stop resource for everything behavioral health. They provide prevention, education, counseling, crisis intervention, recovery support, case management, assisting with paperwork. They do pretty much everything. But they have varying levels of training and education depending on how long they've been in the role. So their certification levels can range from a trainee to a behavioral health practitioner. And at each certification level, they are considered skilled in providing different types of services. So BH trainees are going to be much more heavily focused on kind of the prevention and community outreach side. Whereas when you get into like a level 2 and a level 3, they're going to be much more focused on providing mental health counseling, substance use counseling, and so on. And then at the behavioral health practitioner level, they're at the point where they can actually mentor other behavioral health aides or other behavioral health resources because of their skill and their time and their experience. These positions can also range from zero behavioral health experience, you don't even have an educational background in the field, all the way up to individuals who have a master's in social work. So it really varies a lot. And then one of the things that's really unique about the BHA position is they are what's described as student interns. So they are a full-time behavioral health resource in their community, but they're also full-time university students. So they're going through working on first their associates, then a bachelor of social work, then a master's of social work. And that can take them out of the community, and that can really cause a lot of issues with being able to balance their role and responsibility as the primary behavioral health resource and their responsibilities as a student. So many of the BHAs who are our longest serving, kind of most dedicated staff are from the community. They were born there, they were raised there, they know the community, they know the people. They're oftentimes related to a lot of people in the community. And that's really what makes them most effective and helps with retention. But not all of our villages have a BHA. And then if we're looking at itinerant services, so sending somebody from town out to a village or bringing another BHA from one village to provide services, that can again be really cost prohibitive. And it can also be limited by weather and capacity issues. So we'll talk about weather quite a bit in a couple parts of this. But as an example, Kodiak has kind of 3 different weather bands associated with it. We have the northern part of the island, the middle of the island, and then the south end. And at any given point, all 3 of those can have different types of weather. So it can be bright and sunny here in town, The middle of the island can be socked in with fog, and then the south end can be snowing and snowing with wind, or any combination of different things. And if all three of those don't line up, then you can't fly to that part of the island. And so itinerant services and crisis response can be really limited by just weather factors. Now, BHAs are incredibly valuable, but they're not a cure-all because they are the only resource, because they have so many demands on their time and on their skill. They're not the, end all be all. They can't be. Looking at medical resources, just kind of really briefly, we have a similar program to the BHAs, but on the health side. So community health aides, they're the primary medical resource in the community, an integral part of first response, but their mental health training really varies. Because of their focus as the medical resource of the community, their mental health training is not as robust. It can't be. It's not their core area of focus. And again, the longest serving community health aides are from the community, but not all communities will have those health aides. In terms of first response, so if we're dealing with, crises, village public safety officers or VPSOs, much like with the behavioral health aides and the community health aides, they are that kind of one-stop shop, that one person who does it all. And in this case, it's for emergency services. And the tagline for the VPSO program is first responders, last frontier. And that is because they literally respond to medical, fire, search and rescue, disaster preparedness, public safety, law enforcement, anything that would be considered an emergency or would require a first responder of any type. That role is filled by the VPSO. Now, because of all of their other duties and all their other responsibilities, again, the mental health training and the level of knowledge that they have about mental health can really vary. The longest serving VPSOs are also going to be from the community, but their presence is going to vary. So some villages don't have a VPSO at all. Some have a full-time live-in VPSO. Some communities may have more than one VPSO, and some might have somebody that works a duty rotation. So they're in the village for 2 weeks, and then they're gone for 2 weeks. So it can be highly variable. And then finally, we have volunteers. And so village or volunteer response teams, the VRTs, are really focused on enhancing readiness for and response to emergencies. These are volunteer community members who step up and say, I want to be able to assist my community if there's a disaster or something happens. But again, because these are volunteer positions, there's varying levels of training, and there's usually very little training in mental health and especially in postvention. So one of the initiatives that we've been working on is really helping to make sure that our VRTs are receiving training in programs like mental health first aid and Safe Talk, so that their capacity to assist with mental health issues or challenges being faced by people in their community are a little bit higher. But again, these are entirely comprised of community members. It's entirely voluntary. And so some of those quote unquote optional trainings like mental health first aid trainings are really up to that individual and whether they have the time, the capacity, and the willingness to go through those. While most of their time and effort is focused on things like firefighting and emergency evacuation and medical crises. So to kind of summarize all that, when everybody's fully staffed, fully trained, you have a really solid VRT who has been together for a long time. They've gone through a bunch of different trainings together. Villages can have a really robust array of emergency services, but that's rare. Usually there is some component of this that doesn't quite fit, or somebody is new, or there's a position that's vacant, or multiple positions that are vacant, or any combination of those. And then we also look at, many of these individuals are deeply tied to the community. So our longest standing BHAs, CHAs, VPSOs, VRT members, they're people who are born and raised in those communities. And as I said, they're very tight knit, and oftentimes they're going to be related to a big chunk of the community. So if there is some type of crisis, if there's a suicide, if there's a death as a result of overdose, many of those individuals that we often would rely on for first response and for immediate crisis response, and then postvention after the fact, they're going to be impacted by that as well. So they may not be in a position to be able to effectively respond. And then if we're looking at non-local response, that can either be delayed or non-existent. So for example, Alaska State Troopers, if there is an emergency, they can take anywhere from 2 hours up to a week to respond to a crisis in Akiak or Karluk on the south end because the weather might not be cooperative. When we're looking at Canada's response to these villages, I'll go into this a little bit more later, but again, it can take a couple hours, it can take a couple of days, and a lot of it depends on what is the weather like, what's staffing capacity look like, what is Island Air's, sorry, that's our main local travel company, but what is the travel schedule out to the villages, and then what does the funding look like? So if we assume that there's a crisis, what happens next? What is our current approach? How are we currently dealing with these things? And basically where we're at right now is when something happens, we'll get input from the BHA, if there is one, or the CHA, if there is one, as well as from the tribe and the city and other community partners. And oftentimes that will result in us sending out a behavioral health clinician to provide some type of support, to provide grief counseling, to maybe do a talking circle or some type of community gathering, or to meet with people. And that can work, and it's definitely better than nothing, but it can have some really glaring issues. So for example, the clinician might not have an existing relationship with the community. So there may not be that trust there and that willingness to come to that person to really talk to them about what's going on or what led up to this. You might not always have the same person who's responding, even if it's in the same community, because oftentimes our model right now is really based on, okay, who is available, who can go, who can rearrange their schedule, who has the capacity. Now, as a result of that, again, you might not always have the same person, but you can also have varying levels of training in postvention and post-crisis response. So if it's somebody who specializes in play therapy for children, then their training in postvention crisis response might not be up to date or as robust as somebody who specializes in grief counseling, for example. And then again, no matter who is going out, they can really only spend a limited amount of time in the village before they have to come back into town, because all of our providers are carrying full caseloads as a result of the need and an overall lack of capacity to get more providers in Kodiak. So there's always kind of that pressure and that balance between providing these necessary post-crisis, postvention services out in our village communities and being able to continue providing services to people here in town who are also really in need of services. So as we're looking at this model, it was very clear to us, and it has been for some time, that it needs to be better. It has to be improved. It's not as effective. It's not as beneficial for community members as it can be. It's really difficult on our staff. And so we need to change it. And so one of the things that we're looking at, and we piloted this a couple of times as we're kind of testing out this model and looking forward to it. But what we're really looking at doing is building a team approach to crisis response and postvention. And we're looking at that in a couple different ways, but some of the key things that we want to look at, as noted here on the slide, designating specific staff, making sure that those staff are trained, and then really working to build community readiness, not only so they can respond in a like post-crisis, postvention response, but so that we can hopefully prevent some of these tragedies from occurring in the first place, which will minimize the need to utilize this approach at all. So we're looking at the team approach and what does that actually look like for Canada. We're in a really fortunate position right now that we have a really robust behavioral health department. As I noted, our behavioral health department is almost 1/6 of our entire organization between all of the different people there, and it has a lot of different components. And so as we're building out this idea of a crisis response or a postvention team that can respond, we're really wanting to combine a lot of those different elements and pieces to provide the best approach. So on the mental health side, we have our behavioral health clinicians, we have our BHAs who are out in the villages. We have peer support specialists. That's a relatively new program. It's only been in operation for about a year and a half now. Our substance use treatment program with counselors and substance use focused clinicians. And then other support staff like case managers and prevention specialists who could potentially be rolled in as appropriate. And this type of team approach is really our target because it provides us with a lot of flexibility and it provides community members with options to choose from that might specialize in different areas. So, for example, if there's an individual who is concerned about relapsing because they just lost a family member, a substance use counselor might be available. If there's somebody who needs to talk to somebody about what they're experiencing, we have that mental health resource. If there are people that don't want to engage with a formal behavioral health service, so they don't want to talk to a clinician or to a counselor, maybe they just want to talk to somebody who has also gone through a difficult time and can act in that more peer-to-peer capacity, well, we have cultural peer support specialists. Maybe we have people that need assistance with making travel arrangements or making filling out paperwork or whatever it is. So we have case managers, we have our behavioral health administration team. Maybe they want someone to facilitate community events and community gatherings. That's what our prevention team specializes in. So we have all these resources to draw from. And the idea behind this approach is really combining those into an effective team to respond to crises and to provide postvention services. So when we look at designating staff and kind of building that team, there's a couple different possible configurations that we've looked at, and they all kind of have their pros and cons. And we're really trying to design the model that's going to best fit and is going to make the most sense. So some of the configurations we've looked at are, having a primary team that just responds. You are the postvention crisis response team. If anything happens in any of the communities, you are the team that responds to it, and then having backups that can fill it. We've also talked about having a designated team. So saying, this team will work with this community or with these two villages, and then having different teams for each of those. Having teams that are on call on a rotating basis. So, this month or this quarter, you are the crisis response postvention team. So be aware of that. Or even just saying, okay, the entire department's eligible to respond based on whatever else is going on, but we're going to make sure that we're doing it in a team manner. So kind of combining our current approach with our target approach. And all of these, again, kind of have their pros and their cons associated with them. I'll get into those in a little bit. On the topic of training, that really looks at kind of three different areas. So the first is making sure that whoever our behavioral health staff are on these response teams, whatever their structure looks like, making sure that they're receiving additional training in crisis response, in postvention, in dealing with grief and dealing with tragedies, and making sure that they are comfortable walking into those situations. We also want to work on increasing the base training level in mental health crisis response and postvention for our village responders. So the VRTs, the CHAs, the VPSOs, making sure that their base training level is higher than it currently is so that they're better able to support their communities, especially in the long term. And then when it comes to just general community members, increasing the number of people who have received mental health response training. So currently we use the mental health first aid model, both the adult and youth, Safe Talk through Living Works, the QPR or Question, Persuade, Refer model. So we have a couple of these models, and one of our goals is really to increase the number of people who have received that training, because not only can they be useful in a crisis response and postvention format, but really prevention is the goal here. We want to get to the point where we don't need to have this crisis response, this postvention, or we don't need to use it very often. And prevention is going to be a key part of that. And a big part of prevention is education, recognition, and early intervention so that people can recognize when someone in their community, especially these really small, tight-knit communities, is going through a difficult time and knows how to really address it with them. So that sounds great. Great plan. We're going to adopt this team-based approach. We're going to train everybody. Everything's going to be fantastic. What's the catch? What does the reality look like? Because as I'm sure everyone is aware of who's worked with these programs, reality is often very different from the ideal. And we do have quite a few barriers that we've already run into, even as we're kind of conceptualizing this and putting this new structure together. Some of them, for example, what's the realistic capacity for a contingency program? If this is a, what if scenario, or when this happens, we will do this. What's the realistic capacity to build an entire structured program around that contingency? And then how do you maintain that in the long term if it's not really being used very often? That's similar to the second question. What's the effectiveness of this training going to be if there's low utilization? So it's great that we want to train our postvention teams in grief counseling and crisis response and all of these other things. But if they're not using it very often, especially as hopefully prevention efforts are becoming more effective, how effective is that training going to be? Is it a good use of time? Is it a good use of resources that could be applied elsewhere? What if our designated staff are unavailable? So what if we put a team together and nobody can be there? What if the weather's uncooperative and we just can't get out to a community for a couple of days or a week or more? And then really, how do you overcome that lack of community trust? So in our current model, one of the issues that we can often run into is we are taking a clinician, whoever happens to be available, we're sending them to this community to provide support. Well, what if the clinician has never been to that community before? They've never even spoken to somebody from that village. How do you overcome that trust? And just adding more people into the mix isn't going to make that better. So you have to be really intentional about identifying those barriers and then fixing them. So some of the solutions that we've come up with, for example, are establish new norms. So make the team approach the normal approach rather than just something that is a one-off or something special that has to be arranged. And make sure that all staff are aware of their role in this and that it's an expected part of their duties. So rather than saying, hey, something happened in this community, who can go out and provide support? It's, hey, if you're on this crisis response postvention team, whatever that structure looks like, if something happens, you are expected to respond. You are expected to have the flexibility and the willingness to go out there and respond to this. And then setting that departmental and organizational priority. So I mentioned the trade-off between, client caseload here in town versus responding out to a community. And what we really need to do is we just need to set that departmental and that broader organizational priority and expectation that, yes, our current client caseload is really important. And we want to make sure that those clients are receiving the care and the services that they need and that they came to us for. But at the same time, we need to be able to prioritize responding to a crisis so that we can hopefully mitigate further lead-on effects. And so we are going to prioritize that. And if we have this team that is supposed to be responding to something, we are going to have a process in place where we can essentially set their caseload to the side or put their caseload on hold for, a week or even longer potentially to be able to deal with this situation that has occurred, and setting that as both the departmental and again that organizational priority and expectation so that it's not unusual when that happens. It's not something that we have to seek special permission for or that we have to run through a dozen layers of different approval and authorization. It's just, this is the model we have, this is how it's going to be applied, and then if something happens, we apply the model. And then ultimately creating policies and procedures to make sure that that policy is kind of enshrined and it's in writing, it's formalized, but then also make sure that it doesn't go away with staff turnover. So if we have a really great postvention crisis response team, but then we see some turnover, is that team going to fall apart? Or is it going to keep building in and having new people added to it? If we have a really strong support from our behavioral health leadership or our health services leadership for the adoption of this model, but then that person leaves, well, does the model go with them, as so often seems to be the case? Or is this formalized? Is it written down? And is this just the way that we operate moving forward, regardless of who is on the team or regardless of who is in charge? And so the goal is to really get us to that point that this is an organizational standard. When we look at training and skill building, providing regular opportunities for staff to take trainings on this topic and really participate in skill building when those opportunities come up. So talked about briefly, what's the effectiveness of a contingency management program? How effective is the training going to be? Is it going to be a good use of resources? And again, it really comes down to just prioritizing it. So if we want to make this a priority, then providing staff with the opportunities and the resources to take those trainings, to take skill building opportunities, and also to develop action plans, to work together with other members of the team and with our village-based partners to come up with an action plan so that we don't end up in a situation where we are right now to some degree, where it's, okay, this happened in a community, you're going to go there and provide support. Okay, what does that mean? What does that look like? Building out that action plan and saying, all right, we're going to take this group of people, we're going to go here, we're going to be set up in this particular community, we're going to be set up in this facility, this is what we're going to do. These are the individual oriented things we're going to do. These are going to be the community oriented things we're going to do. And making sure that we really have those plans that are written out and they're concrete. For example, for our village clinics, we have emergency action plans that talk about what do you do if there's a fire at the clinic? What if there's an earthquake? What if there's a tsunami? We have all of those written out as these emergency preparedness plans. And I feel, at least, and I know that a lot of people in my department agree with me, that we should be treating crisis response and postvention in the same way. It should be part of that emergency preparedness plan. And we should be building out these action plans for how we're going to respond to these situations so that regardless of what team is responding, there's kind of a set plan and a set procedure in order to do so. We also want to be building in multiple redundancies. So ensuring that there's multiple backup staff members rather than just saying, all right, you're the mental health clinician, you're the substance use counselor, you're the peer support specialist, you're the case manager, you are our postvention team. What if one of those people is out sick or is away for a training or is on leave? You want to make sure that you have backup staff members, and you want to make sure that the staff who are on those teams, both the primaries and the backups, are engaged with each other, that they have opportunities to become familiar with each other, become familiar with specializations, and that they really have an opportunity to gel together as a team rather than just taking disparate parts of the department and then throwing them all into a community and saying, okay, go support the community. So just like building an action plan, we need to make sure that the team is trusting of each other and has that knowledge and familiarity with each other. And then always make sure that we have a fallback plan. So I use the example here of the entire peer team being out of region. We sent our entire peer support specialist team to a Wellbriety conference down in the lower 48. And that was a fantastic opportunity for them. But what if something had happened while they were gone? What is our fallback? Similarly, if we're looking at sending our entire SUD department to the Region 10 Opioid Summit, which is supposed to be in Alaska this year, what do we do if something happens and that entire team is gone? So making sure that we have those plans in place and those contingencies so that if something happens and we're in one of these unique scenarios where nobody from a team is available, we have a plan in place. We know what we're going to do. Perseverance. Like I've said a couple times throughout the presentation so far, weather in Kodiak is a fact of life. Getting stuck here in town and being unable to go to a village, or going out to a village and then being unable to come back into town because of weather, is a reality. And so one of the things that we need to do is we just need to make sure that we're continuing to try, because it is very easy to say, okay, an incident happened, we're going to send somebody out, or even we're going to send a team out. Well, okay, the weather is bad, and so we can't send that team out because we were only able to put their caseloads on hold for that day or two. And that is not going to be an effective model moving forward. And so making sure that staff have the flexibility to modify their schedules and caseloads to allow for multiple attempts to go out to the villages and for the ability to not come back into town. Because I've seen all too often over the years where people have called out from going out to do health fairs or going out to do community events because their schedule for the following day or for 2 days later was really full, and they didn't want to take the chance that they were going to be stuck there and unable to come back into town because of weather. And so making sure our staff have that flexibility, that that's not a factor, that the priority is the community's well-being, and that that is our core focus. And then on the topic of community trust, we really want to make sure that we're dedicating the time and resources so that we can build trust before there's a crisis. We want to make sure teams have an opportunity to travel out to these villages. And that's why making sure that we have that team structure and that design in place can be so important. And that's why some of the models that we're looking at are having, a team that is dedicated to one or two communities, because that's really going to facilitate this trust building process. Because you don't want a team of people responding to a tragedy and saying, we're here to help you, when the people in that community have never seen them before. That's not going to be effective. And so having that ability to send people out before a crisis occurs will be really key to building that trust and building up that relationship. And we also want to make sure that they're able to interact with community members in a non-formal way. It is a very different context, and it's very different in terms of relationship building if you have staff interacting with community members from the clinic. So if you send a clinician out and they're set up in an office at the clinic and waiting for people to come to them, that looks very different than sending a clinician out and having them participate in a health fair or doing a cultural crafting event at the school with the kids, or going out to participate in a culture week or a culture camp. Those are very different dynamics, very different environments. And the latter, those non-formal events, are going to be much more key to building positive relationships and building trust. And then finally, we want to make sure that our staff are committed to creating those positive personal relationships with communities. So we don't want staff to look at this as, I'm obligated to go out to this community and participate in this event, but I have all these other things to focus on worrying about. We really want to be sending staff out with the goal of fostering those relationships and building that trust. So to kind of summarize all that, our village communities have a lot of resources when they're fully staffed and fully trained, but there's also a lot of limitations and barriers when a crisis situation occurs. And our current approach to crisis response and postvention really has a lot of gaps in it. And we recognize that, and our communities recognize that. And so our goal is to develop that intentional crisis response postvention model using that team-based approach, because in the few instances that we have been able to use it thus far, it's gotten a much better response from the community members and from the staff who are participating. But that approach has additional barriers on their own, and there's still a bunch of things that we need to figure out. The barriers we've identified so far have solutions, but a lot of it just comes down to making sure that we're setting those organizational and departmental priorities and expectations. And the real key that we have here is focusing on our overall mission and vision as the Kodiak Area Native Association, which, as you can see on our logo here, is elevating the quality of life of the people we serve. And if we're able to maintain that and maintain that focus, then building out this team-based approach is going to be much more effective and much more impactful on the people that we're serving and the communities that we are working with. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for sharing your challenges, strengths, important considerations for building postvention teams, response, and most importantly, fostering those relationships and building trust, especially within small communities. And I'm sure many of our grantees here can relate because they work from within smaller communities themselves. And I do see some comments in the chat, but we will be highlighting those and taking questions at the end of the presentation. And I just want to also let everyone know that Mark shared a couple of resources in the chat. It's building a crisis team and postvention fact sheet. So I just want to make sure everyone has time to download those if you need to. And also moving forward, it's my pleasure to welcome Tanya Carter, She is the Suicide Prevention Unit Manager for the Minnesota Department of Health. Ms. Carter has extensive experience in community education programs, program development, and crisis intervention. She is passionate about suicide prevention and reducing the stigma related to mental illness. Prior to joining the Minnesota Department of Health, Ms. Carter worked in tribal and county government, coordinating and leading mental health, mobile crisis, and suicide prevention efforts in rural Minnesota. Ms. Carter is also a Safe Talk trainer. She's an assist trainer, Postvention, and also a CALM trainer. In her free time, Ms. Carter enjoys spending time outdoors with her husband and 2 children. And in the winter months, you'll find her on the ski slopes with her kids. And in the summer, you'll find her family enjoying time at the lake. It's a pleasure to welcome you back, Tanya. Some of you might recognize her because she's previously done some Native Connections work, I believe on the CALM training, which you can find at the Native Connections Resource Center. Tanya?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Val. I didn't know you were going to provide that over introduction, so thank you for that. Val's going to go ahead and share my slides for me as well, so that I don't technically or usually use Zoom, so I always have technical difficulties when I start to share my slides during Zoom. So thanks, Val, for being able to do that. I'm going to share just a little bit of a different, I'm trained in Connect Postvention. And so I'm going to share kind of the model and the framework that we utilize when we go into communities to help them to set up a postvention plan. And so maybe it was something that Matt and his team had used in the past as well, or maybe this will be some repeat of what was already shared, but I'll do my best to make it as interactive as I possibly can. So thank you. So just a little bit of what I'm hoping to cover today is looking to define postvention and really think about postvention as prevention, and then also learning some action steps that we can take to prevent suicide within our communities. And I always like to start off my sessions by just saying to take care of yourself. We've all been touched by loss at some point in our lives, and we never know when something we say, something that we're hearing may just overtake our emotions. And so if any of the following information brings up, painful or emotional memories, take care of yourselves. Do what you need to do to support yourself and anything that would be possible and or helpful. I also put on the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, but please do take care of yourself today and every day. So what does suicide prevention mean to us? When we look at suicide prevention here at the health department, and probably many of you also look at it this way, but thinking of suicide prevention as like that 3-legged stool. So one of those legs with prevention, where we're looking at that early recognition of is this suicide, and really doing like that more of that mental health promotion arena. To the second leg of the stool being that intervention component of really looking at how do we connect individuals who are at risk to the help that they need. So that intervention piece is really where our training, our gatekeeper trainings are coming in for whether that be Safe Talk or QPR or Assist, but really how are we intervening and connecting to that resource. And then postvention is how do we reduce that risk after a death by suicide? And so if we're doing really good prevention work, we'll see that our postvention work is even stronger. So when we think about the ecological model that we utilize within public health, we recognize and acknowledge that it's complex. The issue of suicide is complex. And there's multiple layers that surround us within an individual as well as the community. We know that a death of an individual, it can have that ripple effect across all layers of society. But we also know that in many different ways that it can also promote that hope, healing, and build that safety net for prevention. So if we're thinking about that individual, they also have family, peers, our clans. They have community, a village, our tribe, and the society all surrounding us. And so no one should ever feel alone or isolated within specific situations. So when Matt mentioned conducting local training. So that's a really good example of how we are getting information, we're sharing, and we're training not only those professionals within our communities, but those who are family, friends, caregivers at that local level to also promote more of those protective factors. So when we look at postvention and what is postvention, it really is helping survivors of a suicide loss deal with the loss and grief in an appropriate way that's important for everyone, not only for that individual who lost someone to suicide, but it also helps to take an appropriate action after a suicide. Because if we're being mindful when there is a death by suicide and how we're talking about the suicide, we can prevent future suicides. So, with that, if we have protocols that are established in advance and building that community capacity, postvention becomes prevention, similar to what we just heard in the previous presentation. I'm not going to share the video today, but if you want to hear, and if you haven't already watched the suicide postvention as prevention YouTube video by Ken Norton, I would encourage you to go ahead and do that. It's a short 5-minute video where he really sums up postvention nicely. And so it's just a great 5-minute video that I like to share during postvention trainings within a community to really give everyone that overarching snapshot of what postvention truly is. So when we think about some goals of postvention, it really, like I mentioned earlier, it helps survivors of a loss through that grieving process. So it allows that time and space. It also helps us who are maybe working within the community to identify individuals who may be vulnerable or more at risk for suicide contagion. So an example might be working within a school and there's a death by suicide of a young kiddo. We know that perhaps that individual's friend group may be at a higher risk. And so it helps us to identify those individuals who are maybe close to that kiddo. Cultural practices, it helps us with norms and provide guidance around a response to a grief. So within certain communities, we know that their grief process may be different than another. So if we have that set up ahead of time, we know as responders how to better respond to that community. We also know that if we're providing safe messaging after a suicide, that can help to provide accurate information as well as helps us to talk about suicide prevention in a healthy way. And lastly, ensuring that we have protocols in place helps with consistency in response, no matter the cause of death. So I know specifically today we're talking about suicide prevention, but I like to think about the goals, the objectives that we set up for in the postvention response can be utilized within any sort of unexpected or unintended death per se. The other thing to be cognizant about when we're setting up our postvention plan is to contagion. So what are some of the exposures to suicide that really may influence others to take their life or to attempt suicide? So again, going into details, we want to make sure that we're avoiding the details of a suicide death. The other thing with contagion is having known someone who died by suicide is one of the most significant risk factors for suicide. We also know that teens and young adults are more at risk for contagion. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, it's important for us to really reach out to those friend groups who are close to, if there is an event of a death by a young person, really reaching out to them, checking in on them to make sure that they're okay. The other thing that does create some contagion is media. Media has, I don't know, they tend to make things much bigger. They tend to provide more graphic information. And really, what that does is it creates that heightened sense of anxiety for others who may have experienced a death by suicide, maybe within our family or a local community. And so the media can at times provide some contagion effects within it as well. So one thing that we know is how we talk about our language. People impacted by loss are vulnerable and can experience stigma and discrimination. What we do know is that language is so embedded into our culture. And so one thing we want to be mindful is to be sure that we're talking about suicide in a helpful way. And so on this screen here, you'll see some language that as we are, having conversations with individuals who have lost somebody to suicide or who are attempt survivors, professionals, practitioners within the community, we want to try to shift our language to be a little bit more respectful. But as we know, language, like I said, it's embedded into our head. And so shifting language sometimes can be super difficult. And so we want to try to move away from the words committed. It feels like it's more associated with a crime or a successful suicide. We know that nothing about a suicide is successful. Completed suicide or failed or unsuccessful suicide. To shifting our language to more of those alternative languages, such as died by suicide, or a suicide death, or ended their life, or took their life, attempted to end their life. By shifting our language into these frameworks, we're really providing the space that individuals need. The other thing, I think we've said completed so much or committed in our language that sometimes we catch ourselves saying it, and that's okay. Give yourself grace. This shifting language, it definitely doesn't happen overnight, but if you haven't started to shift the language, I would encourage you to try, give it a try and see how it feels. So just something for you to think about as we're talking for the next few minutes about a postvention response planning. Does your organization or community have a written postvention plan? And if so, what does that look like? How are you involved? What role do you play? Do you have a team of people who are helping in this postvention response planning, or are you the team? If you're the team, I encourage you to reach out to others within your community, whether that be law enforcement, peer specialists, support people, hospitals, others that can help to see that a postvention plan can roll out, because the reality is it's hard to do this work alone. And so recruiting a team is super helpful. And then what teams within your organization or community do you enlist for a response? So if you have a team, within your organization or community, who are those people? And so when we think about a community response, who do you connect with within your community? Like I said, postvention, the response, it should not fall on the shoulders of one organization, one person, but rather the community. It takes the community to respond, not only to respond to a death by suicide, but also to help with the healing. So I encourage you to utilize the partnerships within your community to support those who are grieving, to support the loss of that loved one. So some things that I encourage or like to do as we are thinking about a postvention plan and what it might look like is developing a postvention checklist for your organization. One thing that we know is it's important to first get the facts and confirm the death and manner. We all know that rumors circulate within a community when a death happens. Ooh, what happened? How did it happen? And so we first want to make sure that we're verifying the death. Number one, that it's a suicide. Number two, that the family wants it to be communicated in that way. We want to mobilize the response team. So again, sharing from that school perspective, we may need to mobilize a response team who works specifically with the school. We may want to assess the impact of the school and the level of that response. So who from the school, who from the community needs to be involved in this? We also need to notify other individuals within the school setting who need to know what's happening, where are we going. We also need to make sure that we're contacting the family of the deceased, number one, to provide support to them, but again, also to verify that death and to understand how they want that death communicated. We also need to determine what information will be shared about the death and making sure that we're doing that across the board in a similar manner. So if the information is being shared in multiple sources, we want to make sure that a standard message is being shared about that particular death. We also want to make sure that we identify, again, those staff and students who are affected by the death. And I continue to utilize just the school as an example, also recognizing that this would be the same for any organization as well. So keep that in mind. But really identifying who do we need to reach out to connect with, to maybe provide some additional support to either students or staff that have been affected. We would want to, in this instance, conduct a faculty planning session. So who within the school is part of the postvention response within that school? We would need to have some conversations within that group to make sure that they understand who's going to be available to help support the students over the course of the next 3 to 5 days. When are we maybe going to deliver cards to the family? So making sure that we're setting some strong deadlines of when things will be taken care of. We'll want to look at initiating that crisis support and intervention and services to the youth. So we may need to reach out to external organizations such as our local mobile crisis teams. We might want to let our 988 Lifeline centers know that maybe you will see an increase in calls within the next couple of days. We'll also want to make sure that we're connecting with our school social workers and anyone else who may be supporting the school and the youth within that capacity. We'll want to meet on a daily basis just to connect with regards to planning and conducting, how did yesterday go? What do we need to do today to make some of those mid-course corrections, etc. Planning for memorials. So when is the memorial? When is the wake? when will the funeral be, etc. Making sure that we set a timeline that's appropriate. So maybe we set 3 days for kids to come down to a designated area to make cards, etc., for the family, and then that we'll be delivering them during the wake or the funeral, whatever that looks like, and whatever is discussed within that particular postvention response. We'll also want to make sure that we're debriefing the response. So after our response is over, we'll want to make sure that we're setting up a designated time, typically a couple of days after the response, so that it's fresh in our mind of what do we need to do for mid-course corrections for in the event that this might happen again, or what went well. What do we want to make sure that we do the next time if this event is to occur again? So debriefing is also important. It's also important for us as responders to make sure that we're getting the support that we need as well. So not only debriefing with the individuals who are involved in the postvention response, but making sure that we are taking time for ourselves to go and take care of ourselves. I can say that I was involved in a large-scale postvention response on one of our local reservations, and we facilitated a talking circle to debrief, and that seemed to go really well, and that we were all allowed that opportunity to kind of talk and be there in a similar form. We know that postvention, it's emotionally charged, and the more that our actions can be routine, the better. So thinking about how is your team monitoring and documenting the response? So if you have a formed team, what is your team doing to monitor? Are you, do you have it as a written protocol that all staff within your organization and or community have a postvention document? And are you looking at that and then updating it? If you don't have a formed postvention response, has your team considered creating more of that large scale postvention response, whether that be internal within your organization or within your community? And how are you going to document what that response might look like? Is there a place for response and debriefing internally? So after that response, again, what is your plan for debriefing? Is it written out so that it doesn't get forgotten? The other thing is there a plan for debriefing for those that responded to the situation? Not only internally within your organization, but how are you going to make sure that you're including others from outside the community that may have responded? So in the example that I've been providing within that school, so we have multiple layers within a school of school personnel that will need to be participate in that debriefing, but we also have maybe our local mobile crisis team who came in and provided some support to the kiddos during this last couple of weeks. How are we going to include external partners, those local mobile crisis teams, into our debriefing process? So it's important that we have those things written down, and then again, continuing to build into that evaluation process to really refine and adapt to make changes as necessary. And it also allows us to take time for long-term planning around prevention and our intervention efforts as we continue to move forward. So we're constantly, again, evaluating the processes that are working. And the last thing I just have to share, again, like I said, I provided a higher level overview of what a postvention response, what we might need to think about as we're moving into a postvention response. Who do we maybe need to involve? And so then I just have some resources listed on the next couple of slides. Otherwise, I just thank you for your time, and I'm happy to have further conversations about postvention plans, a response to a suicide, etc.
Val, you're muted.
Oh, thank you so much, Tanya, for that, all that great information. And I'm really excited. One of the things you shared is, you also promote communities to approach healing and wellness from within, and that's something I just wanted to highlight, because as I work with more and more communities, that's what communities are talking about, making it a community-wide effort to promote healing and wellness. So, and that's very exciting. So it's now time for questions and answers. Also, on the slide are some important reminders for you to keep in mind. If you have any ideas for future RLCs, NLCs, and webinars, please let your GTA know. But otherwise, your GTA and GPO are important resources. The Weekly Digest has a lot of great announcements for upcoming events. The SAMHSA.gov website is important as well as, and so is our Native Connections Resource Center, which is accessible by through the Weekly Digest. Getting ahead of myself. Any questions or comments for either Matthew or Tanya?
Looks like Gary has his hand raised.
Oh, Gary.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I have a question for both of you, and you may have already addressed this. The teams that you have put together in the communities, do they rotate so that people aren't on all the time? One community, they had 3 or 4 people that responded to everything, and after a couple of years, they were absolutely exhausted, and they left the team. And they worked out a strategy where some were on for 2 weeks and they were off for 2 weeks. Is that something you guys have built in?
Yeah, from our perspective at CANA, as we're looking at building out this team-based approach, that's definitely one of the factors that we're considering. And so one of the things that we have looked at is, rather than having just kind of a full-time designated team, so like a primary team and then having backups, is having a quote-unquote on-call team that would serve for like a quarter or maybe for half of the year, and then it would rotate through other members of the department, specifically to help with that burnout and those other issues. I think one of the barriers that you can potentially run into with that we're still kind of trying to navigate is making sure that whoever your team is, if you're going through that rotating basis, making sure that they have all of the training and skill building that they need to be able to do it effectively. And that's, one of the benefits of having a single primary team that does respond to everything is they have the training, they have the experience. And so trying to find that balance is definitely something that, as we're trying to build this program, we're trying to find trying to find where that is exactly.
Thank you, Matthew.
I can speak from my perspective of working within the community that I have worked in the past, and we have utilized a model of like a 1 month on for team members, so that we are rotating across the team, and then to keep individuals like involved and up to date with training, we would come together on like a quarterly basis and do like utilizing the incident command structure and having like roundtables to kind of practice different scenarios that we might come into play with. And then it also allowed us all to kind of stay on top of what our policies and procedures are for responding. It also allowed for us to debrief and learn from each other about any situations that we had encountered in any of the months were on call. So typically there was like 3 to 5 individuals who rotated between monthly being on call. So there was like 3 different people, and we rotated like on a quarterly basis per se.
Thank you very much.
We also get burnt out.
Any other questions or comments? I was going to ask Matthew and Tanya, can you please share your email addresses in the chat in case Somebody has questions later. Also, if something comes up and you want to speak with either Matthew or Tanya at a later time, reach out to your GTA. They can help you get connected.
One more thing, I added the resource To Live to See the Great Day That Dawns, the Suicide Prevention Guide. And if people want to download it, I put it in the chat box. And if you want copies of it, they're free, and we can get those to you.
Gary, can you share a little bit more about that? It's a great suicide prevention resource. And Gary does a great job sharing of all the information it has in it.
Sure. It was developed by SAMHSA under DHHS, and what it has in it, it has introduction, the concept of culture, risk and protective factors, risk factors, protective factors, culture as a protective factor, urban natives, cultural connectedness, and suicide inclusion, and then barriers to the suicide conversation, historical trauma, guilt and shame, personal pain, collective grief, politeness, stigma, fear, social disapproval, myths about suicide. And there's responding to a suicide chapter, community readiness, community action, promising suicide prevention programs, and federal suicide prevention resources. There's a lot of information in here. And the one I like especially is how to talk to someone about suicide. And what caught my eye was they were suggesting that before you do suicide work in a community, you ask their permission to use the word suicide, because oftentimes it's just assumed that that's okay, and in some communities it's not, and it's taboo. So asking for permission at the end of each chapter, there are a list of questions to ask the elders, and they're great questions. They talk about how did youth get the message of self-care or protecting themselves as they were growing up in the old days. And there's a lot of questions in here. It's a wonderful resource, and I encourage you all to take a look at it. And if you want, please contact us. We can send 25 out to a community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary.
We also have 2 webinars on it. So if you go into the Resource Center, there should be the 2 webinars that we conducted on them a few years ago. Thank you.
Yes, I can't stress enough the importance of the Native Connections Resource Center. It houses all the previous regional learning communities, national learning communities, all the webinars that we've done in the past, and a lot of other important templates, materials that grantees themselves have also shared. And seeing no other questions or comments, I would just like to thank you all for joining us today. And I wish you well for the rest of the week. Thank you, Kuyana.